Okay, the first question is very broad and easy, and I'd love if everybody could just weigh in on it until we get it, really well polished off. Which is, what is money? What is your definition of money? Well, let's start with Liv, who was the last to be introduced. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first.
So, the first thing to know about money is it doesn't need to have any physical form, and it can take any physical form. It is anything that we use to store value, store wealth, measure value. And in the ancient Roman world, when we're talking about money, I often have to say I study coins, I don't study money, because money could be grain, it could be cattle, it could be credit and banking. So it's far more diverse.
Thank you, Liv. Matt, do you want to follow up? Anything else to add?
So, like, classically, money is, a medium of exchange, a store of value, and a means of a unit of account. And
I knew I forgot one.
And so like in modern times, currencies like the dollar is very clearly fulfills all of those things. But everything kind of lives on a continuum with that, where like if you own shares in a money market fund, like that's so close to being dollars that most people think of it the same way. And obviously there are modern innovations in what counts as money and in how you can monetize things that are interesting, right? I mean, like, obviously a thing that we talk about a lot these days is cryptocurrency, which is probably a store of value much of the time and not much otherwise, not so much a unit of account, although people will be like, oh, my Bitcoin is steady when measured in Bitcoin. But a real thing that people say. But I mean, like one aspect of like modern finance that is interesting is that it is relatively frictionless to convert a lot of things into dollars, and so like having shares of stock is almost as good as having money, and has like a sort of like monetary element to it in a way that like it's not quite the same as owning dollars, but it's pretty close.
Yeah, money is obviously a unit of account. It's something that allows trade. There are conflicting accounts about how money started, and nobody knows. One of the accounts is that originally it's a medium that was used in barter. So you like silver or gold or shells or any other medium. It's part of an exchange system, and at some point, because these medium last longer than, let's say, grain or meat, they become a store of value. And sort of are extracted from the barter system in order to become an intermediary good and not an ultimate good. But having this said, I don't think we should oppose too strictly or modern unit of account and ancient unit of account. There are some very clear historical instances of ancient money being used as unit of account without any physical exchange. And one pretty famous example among ancient historians, there is a New Empire Egyptian papyrus, I think it's 12th or 13th century BC. So on one side of a trade there is a slave, and on the other side of a trade a range of goods, like a piece of clothes and other things. And the slave is evaluated in deben. The deben is an ancient weight unit in Egypt, in deben of silver, and the goods are individually accounted for as well. So this is so much, this is so much. And the papyrus is telling us this is the same amount, so we can exchange them. But actually no money was exchanged, no metal was used. The metal was just used as a scale to measure the terms of exchange, which is not that different of what we're doing today.
Thanks, Gilles. Kurt, you want to weigh in?
Yes. So it's funny. Money is so fundamentally philosophical. Money, like time, doesn't actually exist unless you measure it. And so, and I think those two things are inextricably connected as well. Money is a measurement of the value of something's time, but did time exist before we measured it? Kind of, but how do you quantify it? Like, quantifying is itself measurement, right? So it's the same thing with money, which is why I think the common thread here is everybody's a little bit like, I don't know, what is money, right? And I mean, money is a 6,000-year-old concept as far as we know, and we still are sitting here in New York City surrounded by money and not really sure what it is. So I think that's why the evolution of things, the concept of a coin or the concept of a rye stone on the Isle of Yap, it doesn't matter if it's on the island or at the bottom of the ocean, it's money because we believe it's money. And it's the same thing with time. And so, in short, I don't know, we don't know, you don't know, but it's a debate we've been having as a culture for into prehistory, frankly.
Can I just jump back in with a point that I think hasn't quite yet been made yet, which is that it's the community agreement of value that empowers money. If you don't agree that my money is money, it's worthless in our relationship. So money is inherently relational.
Fascinating. Yeah, there's certainly a sort of like sense of trust in institutions, which is a phrase that we're hearing a lot, usually not in a good context these days, that goes along with the sort of, attachment of value to money. Does anyone know the etymology of the word money? One thing that a PhD in classics will allow you to do is bust out etymologies at cocktail parties. So that's about it. Do you know it? It's not from munus, meaning gift. Professor McGowan, would you care to give? It is indeed. So in ancient Rome, when the Gauls were invading, there were a group of sacred geese, sacred to the goddess Juno, obviously, on the Capitoline Hill in Rome. And as the Gauls were coming, these geese squawked to warn the Romans of their enemies coming. And the way you say warn in Latin is monere. It's connected to the English word admonish, right? And so the Romans, in their polytheistic system, established a cult of the goddess Juno, who warned them about the Gauls' attack through her geese. And that temple eventually became the mint, where the ancient Romans minted their coins. And so the coins were called a moneta, which you can still say in Italian today, amazingly. You can go walk into an Italian bar and say, mi dai una moneta, and it all goes back to the goddess Juno. So money is also a warning from Juno about attacking Gauls. Take that for what it's worth.
Or maybe a monument.
Or also a monument, yeah, sure.
So there's a famous article, or like at least famous in my corner of the world, from the year 2000, written by Meadows and Williams, who were curators of Greek and Roman coins at the British Museum and a real intellectual powerhouse. And they coined the term monuments in miniature. And they really spelled out the way in which Roman coins and the logic of the coin not only connects to this idea of warning, but also to be warned, you need to know what is a danger, so you need to remember. And so Juno Moneta also kept all of the Roman archives and historical records, famously on linen scrolls.
Fascinating. All right.
It's just like the blockchain, really.
Both
I mean, there is obviously a connection between, like, money and record keeping, in the sense of, like Roman coins aside, modern money is exclusively or almost exclusively the province of record keeping, right? Banks or the blockchain or somebody else keeps a list of who has money, and that's what the money is. There's not for the most part some like objective thing in the world that is the money, right? I mean, like you have dollar bills, but they're a relatively small part of anyone's money. What you have is like a bank keeps a list, and that's money, or the blockchain keeps a list, and that's money.
I love that.
Wow, gives new meaning to
Always relevant.
gives new meaning to my to-do list habit. All right. Next up, I have a question. This is for the academics in the room. So we'll start with Gilles. Where does money come from?
If I knew. As you know, writing started about the third millennium BCE, and writing started with accounting. And accounting started with counting value, whether it's grain, cattle, and obviously pecunia in Latin comes from a cow. Mm-hmm. So that's what we know. If we're trying to go, earlier on, there may be hints, like some of these stones with marks, but we don't know what they mean, that have been found in the Neolithic period. But we have no direct testimony of when it started. The only thing we know is that the ancients, so people like Plato, Aristotle, so anyone who thought about money, believed that money started to facilitate trade and was originally a commodity that was deemed an intermediary in the trade process. But that we don't even know if that's true. There are competing theories about how it started.
Okay. Liev, do you want to weigh in on that, or?
He got that covered.
Okay, great. What do our modern financial analysts think about this topic? Anything?
I mean, I started by saying we don't know where money comes from, and I think that's absolutely true. We have evidence. I mean, like you'll find a pile of seashells that appears to have been sorted in a certain way, and it's 40,000 years old, and we can speculate what that is, but we don't know. And so it really begs the question, where did culture start? Where did writing? So we actually don't know a lot of these things. We have the Library of Alexandria that burned down, and we lost a lot of ancient knowledge from that point and back. And we're people with amnesia about all kinds of things. We don't know where all kinds of cultural mores come from at all. We're the product of them, but there's a big problem in that ledger, that database. This is actually what I love about Bitcoin itself, is it's a permanent database that is distributed. It's imagine if there were thousands of libraries of Alexandria, so if one of them burns down, don't worry guys, we can we can check the others. But yeah, we don't know.
Does that mean that sort of civilization is not possible without money?
I would say that it's interesting to note how late coins come into the world. So we know money exists far earlier than the coin. And so maybe that's a way into the question. So there's two inventions of coinage. One, which gives us the European and Mediterranean world. Coin phenomena happened in Lydia, which is a kingdom in what you now think of as southwestern Turkey. And that's one origin point. And there's another origin point for coinage that is in China. And what's really fascinating is the Chinese money, as it evolves, also takes on the circular two-sided things, but it has the hole in the center of it, and it prioritizes writing over pictures. One of my favorite texts from the Han Dynasty is about a traveler writing about traveling west and meeting these strange people with their different approaches. And along with talking about writing horizontally rather than vertically, and writing on skins, one of the things in this Han Dynasty text is a comment on using silver as coinage and putting the head of a ruler on it. And they think this is so strange that this would be what a coin was. But yet, both cultures recognized each other's coins when they met. Humans find a way to communicate even across these cultural divides. And clearly, since it was invented twice, it was useful.
You know, you made me think of two things there. One is how cryptocurrency is really, in many ways, a departure from this politicized version of money that we've been sort of working with. I mean, all of these denominations have usually some guy's head on them, occasionally also a woman. But I guess crypto, that's one thing that is kind of earth-shaking about crypto, isn't it? Is that it's
Doge's head on it. Like, Shiba Inu.
wasn't the Doge like a potentate in Renaissance Venice, or?
Yes,
We're talking about a
Shiba Inu
dog.
talks.
Precisely.
Not that Doge, Jason.
Well, and it's funny because, so a lot of people think that Bitcoin was the first digital currency or cryptocurrency. It's actually not true. There's been attempts at it since the 1970s. There's quite a bit of cryptocurrencies that precede Bitcoin heavily. There are even people involved today. You have David Chaum is a person who's involved in the space still, and he preceded Satoshi Nakamoto's Bitcoin by 10 years. It failed, but part of the reason that it failed was an insufficient amount of decentralization, and then also the fact that for some reason, every time an internet currency rises up, everybody thinks that the first thing to do with it is commit heinous global crimes with it, which is really irritating, but at the same time, if you look at the history of the internet, that's also pretty common, that the first people on the internet basically just were also terrible people and communicated a lot of awful things because, hey, I can now talk to all my crazy friends without having to see them in person and deal with the risk of my neighborhood finding out. And but where you're right is that Satoshi Nakamoto is a pseudonym and sort of disassociated himself from the process of issuance initially, and also made it that he time-stamped it to prove that he did not have some kind of secret stash before anybody else. Imagine issuing 100,000 pieces of gold and saying, here's all the money in circulation, but he's also got 100,000 that he's not telling anybody about. When it becomes popular, all of a sudden he's the richest man in the world. Well, Satoshi Nakamoto issued a white paper as an announcement that it's coming, and then gave people the instructions on how to procure it by a process that was completely fair. So we all have fair opportunity. We're all at the starting line, and we got to mine it over there. And he used the Times, the London newspaper, the headline on the day that it launched, in order to show that in the very first block, this was the headline on that day, to prove that it was not pre-mined or pre-distributed in some way. And ultimately, I think that's as crucial as the sort of headless nature of Bitcoin, is also the fact that it was distributed in a provably fair manner, as opposed to debasement and all the tricky stuff that goes on at the mint or the central bank or wherever your money actually came from. And I think that's part of what makes it special as well.
But you're right that it's also like probably to Satoshi Nakamoto and certainly to a lot of early Bitcoin adopters, it was a really explicitly political and somewhat like libertarian project that was kind of like about rejecting both like the state control of money and, you know, often the state control of anything, right? And so it was a, you know, way to buy drugs on the internet. And there is still a like strong vein of that in crypto today that, you know, intersects very interestingly with like a lot of people are in crypto because they came from traditional finance. Crypto was a way to make a lot of money. There is a desire to make it sort of tamed and regulated and institutionalized so you can like sell crypto to like BlackRock and make a lot of money and like, you know, like live in the US and not go to prison. And then like there's also a vein of crypto that is like all of that is selling out and like undermines the ideals of crypto, which are about statelessness and decentralization and censorship resistance. And like that remains a strong tension today. And certainly early on, like the libertarian side of it was more dominant.
You're right. It is definitely where most of the culture started. It's not most of the culture anymore. I think most of it is the predatory opportunist, I think, unfortunately. But Satoshi Nakamoto, however, scolded the culture at large more than once, very, very specifically stating he was very disappointed that Bitcoin was being used. One of its primary use cases was to fund WikiLeaks after they were deplatformed from payments companies. So He wrote it publicly, and he wrote private emails to various Bitcoin developers at the time and said, guys, I think it's really unfortunate that we're looking like we're a gray market or whatever. He didn't like the gray market, black market sort of thing about Bitcoin. And then actually in his farewell letter to the next lead developer of Bitcoin, he said, his last word was, I really wish you would stop treating this like it's a black market tool, or that I'm some kind of shadowy figure. The shadowy nature of the way you guys are treating this is a problem for what it's actually supposed to solve. And that was his farewell, was do real business, go into the light. Like this is being a drug market money or whatever is ultimately bad for Bitcoin adoption. Please stop.
I want to make a point about what Leif said earlier about money being essentially a social thing, which is that like the way that works most of the time in modern societies, and I think in most pre-modern societies, is that it's a state thing, right? That like the state in some way guarantees like the social acceptance of currency. And one thing that is interesting about crypto is not only that like people are anti-statist or libertarian, but like they found a new way to create social acceptance that didn't rely on the state, right? Where it's like, oh, there are enough people on the internet that they can take this thing that this guy made up and turn it into more or less money, certainly a store of value, and do it without any state sanction and in fact with a lot of state resistance. So like part of it is just like a technological question of like, how can you create like broad social adoption without the buy-in of the state? And the answer is, well, with the internet, and like that's kind of interesting itself.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to our conversation about the origins of money as a concept and the sort of civilizational paradigm shift that it brought about in the same way that like agriculture, one could argue that sort of capitalism and agriculture were sort of simultaneous developments, and the digital stuff seems to make possible another sort of paradigm shift that would move away from a lot of the models we're really familiar with. I have another question I want to get to. Did you want to say something, Leif?
I have a question.
Please.
We use this.
I'm supposed to be the one answering the
I'm
question.
sorry. It's my nature. We use this word mining. How apt of a metaphor or a comparison is it? How far can we stretch it? Do we need a different word, or is it really the right word for how new value is made?
I'm just going to jump in and say that my question was, what is the relationship of money and energy? So you kind of stole my thunder, but it's fine. Go ahead. Yeah.
So it's an okay analogy. I think it was much more apt early in Bitcoin when there were not a lot of transactions. I think the process gives a visual as to what is occurring. I actually run a mining pool myself, so I'm have my own stake in that game. But mining itself is the process of when you reconcile the ledger. If you're the node on the network that reconciles the ledger the best for that 10-minute period, and you get all of the other nodes to agree that you did it the best, then you mine, you discover those new coins. You are essentially acting as the not the issuer, but you're the discoverer. The gold was always there essentially, but you're the one that has now brought it into the economy. So it's an okay analogy, but I think it made much more sense when there were 2 transactions per block, and mostly people were, hey, I'm getting 50 coins every 10 minutes, and there's only 10 of us doing it. It was a much more apt analogy. I think now, as the space matures, treating them a little bit more as a transaction processor is the value. And actually, the way that Bitcoin specifically is designed is that the amount of coins that are mined per block cuts in half every 210,000 blocks, or roughly 4 years. And that very explicitly is designed to make it that the value of being a node on the network moves from discovering coins to processing coins, because every transaction has a fee, and at some point the amount of coins that you mine per block will be 0. And so how does the network keep itself secure? It's by facilitating the transactions of everybody doing it. So it's designed fundamentally to move toward a payment processing network, and if it doesn't, it fails. Very, very much by design, Satoshi wanted it to go away if it was not used as a processing network for commerce. So,
Yeah, I'd like to come back on the word mining. Obviously, for an ancient historian, mining refers to, we used to find gold and silver and copper to mint or melt metal and then create coins. And using that word mining sort of, in a way, close the cycle where we're coming back to the origins of money. And if I hear what has been said about maybe we don't trust the state, maybe it's a matter of a lack of trust, the word trust in Latin is fides. Fides gave the word in English fiduciary, and lots of words built on that fides concept. But essentially, the ancient states, before the invention of fiduciary money, so the capacity of money to decouple from a fixed supply or a constrained supply of metallic sources, so before that time, the state ability to manipulate the currency was extremely limited. And there have been instances of inflation. Obviously, the 3rd century in the Roman Empire witnessed strong inflation. But why? Because the Roman authority debased the coinage. So coins that used to have at 60% silver went to 50, 40, 30, 20, and so forth. So prices increased. But effectively, what we find out is that the value of gold and silver as commodity against real goods, like grain or different staples, was stable. So the benefit the state found in doing this was extremely limited because the price adjusted immediately to the debasement of a commodity of the medium itself. So the state had limited ability to rob citizens, if I may use that term. And I guess the crypto project had something like this. We've seen inflation in the 70s and obviously in the 20s and 30s, and after World War II with multiplication of currency supply. And we're seeing it today again. So,
Is what you're saying, and I had this thought earlier, are you saying that Bitcoin is more real?
well, it's as real as anything else.
What?
So what is Bitcoin is ultimately just a ledger of account that's spread out across lots of computers. And so if everyone can verify independently what the amount of coins in circulation are, who owns what at any given point, you can see every single state change of the ledger. It kind of turns everybody, or it gives everybody the opportunity to become an auditor, and therefore, and this was actually Satoshi Nakamoto's first statement, the creator of Bitcoin, explained there will be no more central bank debasement of the currency because we all have the ability to audit the ledger ourselves, or the ability to trust the proof of work, which is a whole other concept that I could frankly talk about for hours. But you're willing to trust somebody who's willing to give a costly signal and a very powerful attestation that you can trust that they have audited it properly, as opposed to the central bank, which people, and many, how many people know a central banker that they can call and say, hey, what's the actual process? It's limited. But if that central banker and whoever, the node on the network, had to do something crazy. So imagine if you would only open your door if somebody would do 50,000 jumping jacks before they knocked on your door. Well, they would only knock on your door if it was for a really good reason, right? And that's kind of the point of proof of work. That's done digitally, it's done with computers, but it's a conversion of electricity to a massive quantity today to say, hey, these people over here are willing to spend millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars annually in order to say, hey, we really, really care about auditing the system really, really well. In fact, perfectly. And if we do not do our job perfectly, we're split away. We're cast off. And that's the system.
That said, it is not the case that the value of the dollar is currently tied up in the quantity of silver you can redeem it for, right? And or even, frankly, in the number of dollars that the Fed prints, or the Mint prints. And I think that one sort of aspect of modern economics is that the value of money is in its social acceptance, and the dollar has had inflation in recent months, but generally speaking has been a pretty good store of value for some number of decades. And Bitcoin has had a massive ramp up and then a lot of volatility in its social acceptance, such that if you bought Bitcoin a year ago, you've suffered horrible inflation compared to someone who has dollars. And that's not because someone printed a lot of Bitcoin, right? It's because the thing that determines how many units of currency you can trade for a sandwich is basically its social acceptance, and that is bound up in a lot of social dynamics that are not purely the number that have been printed.
I have one more question to change the subject a little bit, and then I want to open it up to the audience. And my final question is as we look into the future and see AI coming towards us, this sort of monstrous force of computerized efficiency that is automating jobs and reducing jobs. And people talk more and more about UBI. What does a society look like in a more moneyless society? Either in parse that however you want. Either in terms of where money itself starts to lose value because wage labor becomes obsolete, or where a certain percentage of the population are, as they used to say in ancient Rome, given bread and circuses to keep them sort of fat and happy by the state. Are we moving towards that, and what's that going to look like?
I think absolutely we're moving toward that, and it's just another level of predatory control over human nature. It's a desire to do that. This is why it's really important that Bitcoin is an electronic cash system and not an account system. If a government can control an account system, so my PayPal account or my bank account, or we just saw Kanye West has been deplatformed, not just from society and social media, but he has been deplatformed from his banking institutions and various things because he has admittedly awful opinions about things, but it's an indicator that they can just turn a switch. That can be done, and we have proof of that in the last month because of one guy that ran his mouth about a bunch of stupid nonsense, and then he can be very trivially censored from the economy of the country he lives in. Regardless, the man was a billionaire until very recently, and he has to know what it's like to be digging in his pockets and say, oh shoot, how do I buy groceries this week? All of a sudden, all my systems got shut off, and that's a very scary thing to notice that can be done in a culture to somebody who was very high up until quite recently. And so most blockchains also are account-based systems, and people don't realize this, that Bitcoin is actually very uniquely a cash system in that the money that is circulated, every single unit of account is itself a very specific unit of account. So while a Satoshi, a sat, or is like a penny, is itself fungible in its value, it is actually a unique penny. The penny in my pocket is that unique penny that was mined and stamped and whatever. Same with a Satoshi. And so it makes it that much more resistant to that sort of thing by both its distribution and the fact that the way that the database is managed is like a cash system. And so the beauty of it is you can also run a fiat currency tokenized on top of Bitcoin. That is something a lot of people don't realize can be done. So you can actually have a both-and system where the supply of your fiat currency, your dollar or your euro or whatever else, or a basket currency, which I think is a really interesting thing to do, but that can exist for your payments. You can go buy a hot dog on the corner or go put money in and out of your local bank, but it can be underwritten on top of Bitcoin, which is itself a separate distributed system. And I think that that's really important given some of the risks of modern society.
I mean, even away from that, the sort of libertarian, like even with in the confines of state money, I think people do think about questions like you're asking about, a sort of post-work or post-scarcity economy. And, I mean, to get back to the question of what is money, I mean, one way to look at it is that it's a sort of accounting of claims on society, right? You can ask for stuff from society by handing over green pieces of paper. And, the way you get those pieces of paper right now is by doing stuff for society. So you do your job, they give you stuff, then you go to the grocery store and you exchange the money for stuff. But like in a world where like the robots do everything, you can still have some mechanism for distributing, you know, the stuff that the robots do to people. There are a lot of ways for that to go really poorly, right? Like if Jeff Bezos invents those robots and then owns all those robots, then he owns everything in society, and like you just get like his largesse, you know, to the extent he wants to, right? But you can certainly imagine, and governments, you know, are in like the early stages of thinking about other ways to distribute the products of the robots so that all of the people put out of work by the robots can still get the stuff. And like, you know, people talk about like post-scarcity economy of like Star Trek, where like the robots build all the stuff. And it's like, you know, like there are a lot of ways to tell that story as a utopia where like the robots do stuff and you just like hang out and consume the stuff.
Read Latin.
Yeah. Right.
Just saying.
And then there are, you know, there are transitions from like modern capitalism to that future that sound very dystopian indeed, where like the guy who invents the robots ends up owning all of the stuff. And you just sort of like, you hope that governments, or like, you know, libertarians, but probably governments, manage that transition well.
Indeed. Anyone else have any final thoughts on this light, whimsical topic that we've decided to end on?
So I promised Jason there was no way I was talking Star Trek at this thing. So I'm really glad that it was Matt who brought it up.
It's an important like piece of economics. There's actually a book about the economics of Star Trek.
Oh, I can't wait to read it.
It's really good.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about bread and circuses. Just because you had mentioned this as sort of, and then on the other hand, bread and circuses for the masses. So the phrase bread and circuses comes from Juvenal, who's a satirist. And he's just, you know, telling us how crappy everything is. And the whole phrase from the Juvenal's 10th satire, he says the people who used to vote and award consulships and the greatest power in the world, no longer do they vote, they just cry for bread and circuses. Cultural relativity here is really important. Circuses are not, like we think of a circus today, as simply entertainment. They're a form of collective religious action. And in the Roman world, the circus remains the place where people are able to express to their leadership their views through public collective action, while simultaneously helping to ensure the survival of the state by maintaining the peace of the gods, the Pax Deorum. And bread is, in my mind, in Juvenal, a stand-in for the basic needs of life. The Roman state has controlled the grain supply, ensured that large urban areas are sustainable even without agricultural participation, that the water is readily available and clean, that the city doesn't burn down. The fact that the Roman people in Juvenal want bread and circuses isn't trivial. It's saying that at this point in time under a dictatorship, they may no longer have a vote directly to participate in government, but they still care intensely about their survival and the welfare of the community as a whole.
So Twitter and seamless is like the modern...
Yeah, Twitter and seamless.
One last point from Gilles, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Yeah.
And I'd like to build on what you said. If we had that conversation in the subway coming here, and I was telling Jason, if AI can produce everything we need physically, we don't need that much. I mean, calculate calories, and we could be sitting somewhere and having our calories delivered to us. I told Jason, so this is communism. That's, you know, how Karl Marx defined an utopian society. But if you're moving one step further with AI and the metaverse, so basically people are fed, and then the metaverse brings them the life of their dreams, whatever it could be. So then it's the matrix model. And in such a model, you don't even need an elite anymore. Why would you be an elite in a matrix world? So if we push further, it's almost like extinction in a way.
All right, on that note, let's turn it over to the audience. I'd like to try to get the questions recorded too, so if you'll be patient, we could pass one of the mics around.
This is great. And that's a depressing note to end on, so I'm going to ask a different one. One of the things that I've always wrestled with is the simple observation that monopolists tend to really like their monopolies. They tend to guard them jealously. Central banks have a monopoly on making money. Why have they not yet exercised that monopoly given the growing competition from crypto? And this is something that I wonder if this doesn't pose an existential threat to crypto if at some point central banks around the world begin to realize that their monopoly is genuinely in danger.
I actually think it's crystal clear that they have. So I'm I'm a bit of a contrarian in the Bitcoin space because if you look at the way that central banks function, people think of them as this gigantic faceless organization, but the way that they actually distribute funds is through commercial banks. So if you go to JP Morgan Chase or Bank of America, like these are actually surrogates of the central banks themselves. The money is distributed into the economy through them. And so if you go back to the early days of Bitcoin, there was two major groups in Bitcoin. There were the hardcore libertarian, like we need to create a separatist society and be all dark web all the time, which is very interesting. But then there's also the side that was very into the concept of disrupting cash payments as well as various things that you can do with tokens, identity, and some of these other things. But what they realized is that each of those things threatens the central banking system, not the banks themselves, but the system that is created by them in two very different ways. And one of them is much more easy to control. So the dark web thing, the persistence thing, also lends itself to being this monetary asset that goes up in value. And if you make Bitcoin about Bitcoin's price, it's very easy to bring people in who just want to buy Bitcoin because they want to be richer in 2 years than they were today, which then makes it much more easy to regulate and keep it in a very little box. And all of a sudden, Gary Gensler's on Fox Business talking about all the ways we need to regulate Bitcoin, instead of everybody talking about all the ways that Bitcoin was able to disrupt both micro and macro commerce and payments, which is not something we hear almost anything about. The reason for it is that these commercial banks and payments companies started to create these incubators using shell company after shell company to start buying up developers and development organizations, building these cryptocurrency exchanges, these wallet things, turning everything very investment, very Silicon Valley. Everything's got a bubbly logo and, hey, put your money here, you'll make more money later. That makes it a regulatory asset. But look at who invested in these things. It's companies like Citigroup, Bank of America. It's these surrogate things of the central banks that incubated these companies that are now companies like Coinbase, Kraken, the big custodians, BitGo, Fireblocks. A lot of these companies in the space all got their money from surrogates of the central banking system and has turned it into this, hey, Bitcoin's bad, FTX collapsed, and blah, blah, blah. And I think that that is a way to keep Bitcoin just interesting enough or just kind of punk rock enough to make people feel like, hey, I got rich and I still get to wear a hoodie to work. That's really cool. That's my revolution. But that's not actually the revolution. They also made it that they still get to stay in power and maintain the power of the existing system that way. So everybody's happy. There wasn't any real change except for people like me got just rich enough to say, you know what, I really don't want to rock the boat at this point. We're good.
I'm not sure I would tell the story that way, but I do think that the answer to your question is, one, crypto is not particularly a threat to the central bank monopoly on money creation. Crypto assets look to me like speculative tech stocks, which anyone can always create, right? But they don't look so much like a competitor to the dollar at this point, in terms of transactional use or stable store of value or anything else. And then two, to the extent that they are like a threat to the payment system, central banks are very interested in central bank digital currencies and building, taking some lessons from crypto and sort of domesticating them and using them as the next step of central bank currency. Yeah. So I think they're not too threatened, but they're doing what they would do to maintain their monopoly.
Saw a question in the back. Could we pass that? Thanks, Teddy.
Hey, thanks all of you for taking the time to come, and thank you to PAIDEIA for hosting. Hi, Jason. So first of all, I just want to put a cherry on top of the uplifting conversation you had a second ago about post-labor economies, saying that nobody confronted the gorilla in the room that, yeah, you could have robots do it, or like Sparta, you could helitize the people next to you, i.e. enslave, which is not a dead idea. Like, that almost happened 80 years ago in Eastern Europe. But that's really neither here nor there.
Qatar World Cup.
What?
The Qatar World Cup is a good example of helitizing your neighbors.
Yeah, I mean, fair enough. And it can happen in a capitalist society too. Anyway, that's not actually the question, sorry. I wanted to ask about, we talked a lot about the difference between a material economy or a material-based money system versus just like a social promise to receive value in exchange for your token or whatever it may be. And I was thinking about, like, in Rome in the 3rd century, if you debase the currency by 10%, then goods will kind of automatically correct to that new level, right? Or if it's Spain in the 16th century, eventually new silver will stop appearing and goods will recorrect to a new price relative to the amount of silver that is now in the new economy. But today, when there's no material aspect to the dollar at all, it is only a series of promises. Is inflation knowable? Is it understandable? Is it predictable? And, like, frankly, what is it? And I'd love your thoughts.
Sorry, I'd like to first reply to the Roman part. And what I was saying before referred more to the 4th century than the 3rd century. In the 3rd century, we witnessed some price stickiness, what economists call price stickiness. So we're seeing the quantity of silver in the regular coin decrease, but price don't adjust immediately. It takes a while. And sometimes price adjusts by jumps when people realize, oh, by the way, something's happening. So as long as, let's say, there's 30% of silver in coins, it's fine. The coins still look like silver. And then suddenly, at, I don't know, 20%, it's like, it's no longer a precious metal, it's a piece of crap, so I'm not going to accept that coin anymore. So it's not a continuous process. And and I want to correct, or let's say be more precise about what I was saying before about the 3rd and 4th century. In the 4th century, it's very much instant adjustment because people have got used to it. So there is a kind of learning curve about what the state is doing. So that's for the Roman part.
I don't know how to predict inflation. I feel like the central bank has a, okay record of, targeting inflation and getting there. But, it's like, it's a set of social institutions. And like, there's a knob you turn and, you sort of look at how the social institutions react to it. I don't know that there's a better answer than that.
Okay. Any more questions from the audience? Yes, right here, Kathy.
Matt sort of talked about this earlier, but I was wondering if anyone had thoughts on crypto in, I guess, the stakeholder theory of money. So the idea being that, like, money has value not just because it's a store of value or exchange or anything like that, although that is part of what money is, but that a central stakeholder, so usually governments, I guess, create demand for money by taking taxes in money. So, like, how do you create demand for something that no government has decided you can pay taxes in?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a classic, like, story of money is that, like, you create the debt obligation to the state of taxes, and then, like, the money is accepted in order to pay the debts. I don't know. I mean, like, it has always seemed intuitively to me, with no quantification, that couldn't be the main thing driving the value of the U.S. dollar, right? Because, like, most people who want U.S. dollars don't pay U.S. taxes, right? I mean, there's like a ton of demand for it from all over the world, or from rich people in America who don't pay taxes. So, like, that can't be like, there's probably some it makes sense to tell that story of, like, that is the floor supporting the value of the dollar, because, like, that's the thing where, like, the U.S. can come to your house and extract dollars from you, so you'd better have dollars. But, like, I don't know, it doesn't strike me as being, like, the sort of core of the story now. And I do think that, crypto, like, shows that up, where it's like there's a lot of forms of social acceptance, and, like, being able to use a thing called money to pay your U.S. federal income tax is like one part of it, but like, you know, like you can do lots of stuff with Bitcoin, including pay your taxes, that, you know, by you can sell things. And like that, you know, that's sort of like, the sort of main driver is a sort of like fuzzy web of social acceptance rather than it is a specific like law that says this is what the money's worth.
Well, we don't know why we value anything. Government is also a thing that doesn't actually exist unless we pretend it does. They're just people. Like your laws are just ideas that have been written down, and then we decide to obey them or not obey them. But it's just like anything else. Like we make the decisions about what we value and what we believe and what we obey based on either what we love or what we fear. And one of those things is going to drive how you behave in regards to other people, your economic opportunities, and everything else. So I think that the notion that the thing that gives money value is the fact that really anybody will accept it. I think it's irrelevant what the entity is that accepts it. But if I'm willing to do business in Bitcoin and you want the thing that I'm willing to do, maybe it's just money between us, and that's also okay in a very limited capacity, but that's okay.
Any other questions? Yeah, can you wait for the mic just so we get it recorded?
If we go back to very early times now and look at the introduction and acceptance of money, prior to that, we have things that are called socially embedded economic systems, where everybody works for the benefit and nobody's supposedly keeping track. And then money gets introduced in primitive societies that we know of in the 19th century by special situations occur. Something from the outside comes in and imposes the use of money. People have problems with transactions with certain groups and societies, and they invent special purpose money, and then that spreads out. My question for you is, do you believe in the very early days in Europe, it started out as special purpose currencies that spread in usefulness, or do you think it was an explosion of interest in something very interesting?
So, the standard answer for in the classroom is that states make money to make payments. So when does the state bother to strike coins? It takes a lot of effort. It is labor intensive, and most of the time ancient states don't need to make money to function. They're perfectly capable of collecting taxes in kind. When they start paying, and the main thing they need to pay for is soldiers, and particularly soldiers who cannot be conscripted, so mercenaries or allies, or they decide to borrow the model of paying soldiers to make it easier to motivate their conscripts, the people who are obliged to be in the system. Once the soldiers have money, then they need a way to spend it. And we really see this payment of large payments of soldiers to soldiers being a means by which coin distributes in wider populations and communities.
So are you suggesting then that it is military activity that introduced money, as militaries often do?
I am from the school of history that loves footnotes over generalizations. So I'm not going to go there, but I could see a way where we could write that narrative.
Did you want to make one other point?
I'd love
Both
to
you guys? Yeah.
You sure? Yeah, go ahead. So there's actually a jumble of evidence of all these things. What is a salary? Why does a salary exist? How is salary paid? But there's a lot of evidence, not just from governments paying soldiers or to accomplish large tasks. But there's also evidence of very small microeconomies that grew out of the sort of kind of what we would think of as like a pawn shop today. essentially being a place where, here, I will hold a thing, I will issue you credit. If this credit comes back to my store, I will then accept it as a circulation. And then these sorts of proto pawn shops became what we think of as banks, but it was essentially a credit system. And so there's evidence of that too. But like I said earlier, there's a lot of missing history as to how any of this stuff grew out conceptually. There's so much history that we don't know about all kinds of things in our culture, and money is one of those things that there's just a jumble of evidence that shows that a lot of things probably were invented in multiple places in multiple times, and probably for very different reasons in those different places. And I think it's kind of a both-and answer that truly an academic has to say, we don't know, and the search is ongoing.
Gilles?
Yeah, but the one thing I'd like to add, well, I agree that military expenses are or facilitate or support the creation or the increase of the supply of money. This said, I'm not such a friend of linking military activities with money. There are many periods of history where there are, not dislocations, but or little correlations. But coming back to your question, it seems to me you have two processes. One is trade, and one is internal complexity. Ethnologists will find, many societies we found in Amazonia or Indonesia or other areas, small groups of people that did not use money. So when money became necessary, and we have ancient testimonies as well of barter, like the Carthaginians wanted gold from West Africa, so they would sell to West Africa, sell, anchor on a beach, bring goods somewhere, leave the place. The local people will bring some gold if they think the quantity of goods are good enough, or if not, they will not bring the gold, so the Carthaginian would come back and add. So there was a barter system that is described by some ancient sources, like 4th, 5th century BC. So trade is one aspect where money facilitates things. Then it's internal complexity. In the cuneiform tablet of the 3rd millennium BCE, we see accounting tablets. Why? Because cities of Ur and Uruk and all these, these cities have 10, 20, 30,000 inhabitants, and you can no longer keep track of, am I more useful than my neighbors? Have I done my share? So you need some accounting system, and that's how money starts in these societies, I think. The last thing I'd like to add, some very recent statistical analysis of late Neolithic and Bronze Age and early Iron Age period troves of metallic fragments are, across Europe, have come to the conclusion that most likely a kind of united system of measurement and weight system spread from the Near East into Europe based on the shekel. The shekel is around 8 grams. Then you're getting the mina. Then you're getting the talent, same as like in the Bible. And there are variations, but we're seeing all these weights and fragments and ingots and pieces of jewelries and so on. The weight system sort of coalesce around statistical peaks, and this is true, from the Near East into continental Europe, into the late Bronze and early Iron Age period. So it looks like something that becomes almost like a currency zone before we're talking about them.
Great. Okay, we'll do one more question from Wade, and then we'll go back to the bar.
You mentioned proof of work chain, which, from my understanding, is based upon either computational power, use of energy, and I believe that sustains the value of Bitcoin. Is that correct?
I would argue that it doesn't sustain the value of Bitcoin, but it is a crucial aspect of the accounting process.
Okay, and there's been mention about coinage throughout the centuries, and coins are no longer used at all. They eventually lost their value, replaced by paper or accounting. And is the model that Bitcoin is based on? Is it sustainable? Is it something that will fall aside like coinage? You think, because of this need for resources at one time, to mine the metals, the alloys. I mean, it was quite expensive. And eventually we realized, hey, there's a much cheaper way of passing money around than minting coins. I mean, it seems quite expensive to mint crypto, Bitcoin.
You look like you want to comment
I
first.
feel like you're a Bitcoin maximalist, and I want to give the answer that like a lot of crypto has done that and has said, we're going to move on from proof of work, and we're going to have a ledger keeping system that has some of those properties that is basically like you demonstrate you have some stake in the system so that we are likely to trust you, but you don't run your computer constantly doing millions of calculations to burn a lot of energy to prove that you've done the work. There's a less energy intensive system. So Ethereum, which is kind of the number 2 cryptocurrency, basically moved to that system earlier this year, and a lot of like the other blockchain systems moved to that system. Bitcoin is Bitcoin is a little bit more hard to kind of turn the ship, and so it seems somewhat unlikely that Bitcoin will move to that system. I think if you'd asked me 3 months ago, I would have said that is an argument for the possibility that these other cryptocurrencies will rise in popularity as people become more attuned to like environmental concerns, and also because it's wasteful. And Bitcoin will decline in popularity. I think that recent events unrelated to proof of work have increased the status of Bitcoin and decreased the status of other cryptocurrencies. So I wouldn't make that prediction now. But I do think that that question is very much being asked, and I think that there is a lot of push in crypto broadly, not necessarily so much in Bitcoin, to move away from the the extensive work that is put into Bitcoin mining. But I'll leave it to the Bitcoin person too.
So proof of work is about establishing trust in a hostile environment. That's the point. It's kind of like how if you were to get a personal trainer, you would want a personal trainer who has six-pack abs. And if your personal trainer looked like me physically, you probably wouldn't want to take my advice on how to become a Herculean athlete, right? And the reason is that I have a very public display of my figure that indicates the amount of work that I do to my body for the sake of aesthetics. And this is, see, it's funny because it's true. And so the point of proof of work is that demonstration that, look, you can absolutely trust me to do an absurd amount of a thing in order to have the right to account for this ledger in a way that matters. And to contrast that against proof of stake, which was the other model, it's the direction that Ethereum has gone, is that the stake model is, it's like, it's a delay on that sort of reputational model. So if you have a certain amount of Ethereum, you then have the right to account for that ledger. And if you have more Ethereum than anybody else, then you have the right to account for it more than anybody else. But as a reward for that accounting on Ethereum, you gain more Ethereum than the person that has less Ethereum than you. So you kind of create this bizarre, impenetrable aristocracy over time, where the largest staker is also the largest grower in stake, and it just becomes a model of, first of all, I think it also sort of makes the network itself more of a corporation than a money system, but that's also a legal philosophy debate. But in proof of work, we've seen the biggest mining pools in the world, the people that when people say, oh, they're a monopoly, they'll never break down, we have seen billion-dollar companies decide to use their proof of work and attempt to steer the network in a way that is predatory and go out of business inside of a year. In fact, multiple of the largest mining companies in the world right now, just over the last 6 months, have gone bankrupt over the fact that they made a miscalculation about how the network should work, and it eats their lunch. And that's kind of the beauty of the proof of work system, is that if you do the wrong thing in maintaining and creating value on the network, you fail, and you're immediately, or not immediately, but very quickly, much more quickly than in other systems, you're replaced by the next best entity that is trying to be the most valuable creator of value on that network. And so it's kind of this perfect attempt, or it's an attempt rather, at perfect capitalism, essentially, at that level of the network, and saying, look, we're not going to make any concessions at all on the auditing of the system. So we can make concessions on all kinds of other things, but the auditing of the system is 100% Darwinian, like the strongest must survive, because that's how you make sure that the money is the most powerful and is the most trustworthy, period.
And back to your white paper, you mentioned that the inventor threw out there.
Yeah. So
nice clash of the ideal, the ought, versus the is.
Sure.
The is sometimes works, takes over.
For sure. Well, so you also mentioned sort of the wasteful, and the word wasteful has come up a couple of times. And who here in the room thinks we should shut power off at local hospitals? Anybody? So the reason why is that
Bitcoin is just as important.
well, money is just as important. A fair accounting of value is just as important, in my opinion. And so we don't shut the power off at the hospital because we believe that what they're doing at the hospital is a net good for society. We want people to be taken care of. And if you believe that money can be used as a tool of oppression, or a tool to manipulate people into being puppets that some faceless puppet string puller is steering, then money itself, let's take the Bitcoin aspect away from it. I'm not a Bitcoin permabull. I don't care if I become a multimillionaire because of Bitcoin or any of that. That's not the point. The point is to have something that can be used as a fair accounting of value globally that we can all agree on. And if we can all agree that something has value for reasons that are not political, that are based entirely on performance and competition, then that has its own innate value. And I think that matters. Obviously, people disagree, and they're welcome to disagree, but
so you're a proof of worker.
I am 100% a proof of worker. I think everything else is a problem. It has a cancer the same way that all kinds of other bad ideas sound good in the short term, but ultimately lead to an aristocracy. This is kind of what I was talking about with like the takeover concept. You've disrupted enough. Now go be happy somewhere else. Proof of work is the only thing that truly allows anybody to become king by creating the most value. And the second they are not the best at creating value, they're no longer the king. And I think that really matters. It's the only thing that's like that.
I hope you'll join me, though, in thanking our columnists. And we are going to hang out. The reception is here, so please help us eat this spread. And I think the bar will remain open a bit if people want drinks. Thanks all for coming. If you'd like to get involved in the American Numismatic Society or learn more about the classics through the PAIDEIA Institute, please grab a brochure, which is on the bar, or stay on our mailing list. Thanks again for coming out, everybody.